Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is a brief recap of my lecture on ethical relativism. In my last lecture, I started off by sort of warning against being confused about the term relativism. Be sure that you see, um, phrases and vocabulary and jargon within the context of the field that they're being used. And within ethics, relativism refers to the idea that moral values are merely relative to a certain perspective, to a mind or perhaps a group of minds or a tradition. And so this is usually broken up into two levels, cultural relativism and individual level relativism. Cultural relativism claims that moral values are always merely relative to a certain cultural tradition. And individual level relativism, often called simple subjectivism, says that moral values are always relative to an individual mind and an individual perspective. And more specifically, all forms of relativism connect moral judgment, let me rephrase that. Simple subjectivism, as a name of individual level relativism, also connotes the idea that moral judgments and morality are inherently or intrinsically connected to the feelings of the subjects. So, to put it simply, simple subjectivism claims that when we use the language of morality to say that certain actions are moral, morally permissible, or immoral, that language is merely a report of the presence of either a feeling of approval or a feeling of disapproval, what I sometimes half-jokingly refer to as some kind of likey or no likey, some kind of positive feeling or some kind of negative feeling. I talked a little bit about the way in which this is a very tempting idea for many people. I think in part because we often confuse simple subjectivism and cultural relativism with the ideas of relativism that come out of other fields like anthropology, where we're trying to be more open-minded, we're trying to see life, through the lens of another person or another society or another tradition as much as is ever possible. However, it's a mistake to confuse ethical relativism or relativism within the context of the study of ethics with that kind of tolerance and open-mindedness. And so I gave you some ways to understand why that would be a mistake. I then went on to utilize some of the work of the deceased American philosopher James Rachels and gave you some arguments that he used in arguing against the utility or practical value of, or perhaps even conceptual coherence of forms of relativism. I focused on simple subjectivism, and I offered you an argument about how it implies certain how it has certain absurd implications or implies certain absurd consequences or results. This is a kind of a utilization of what we call in philosophy reductio ad absurdum arguments, or reduction to absurdity arguments, where you take a position, you think about its implications, and if any of the implications seem just patently absurd, you have good reason to reject the position. And so we talked more specifically about the way in which simple subjectivism is tied to the impossibility of genuine moral disagreement. We also talked about how simple subjectivism seems to imply moral infallibility. And I added one more idea that simple subjectivism implies no moral progress on the part of the individual. And then I also suggested that all of these arguments can be reframed so as to be critiques of, or reductio ad absurdum arguments against, cultural level relativism as well. And so that moral progress argument can be used to sort of point out something that seems on the surface of it absurd, and that is that societies can make no moral progress. And so these are reasons why we might reject forms of ethical relativism, and yet, again, following Rachel's a step further in his argument, I explored some sort of probabilistic claims about why people still tend to fall for relativism. Again, I think that most people just fall for it before they understand it, really what they're saying and committing to. But Rachel's offers some interesting accounts, especially in the context of the modern age and the modern crisis that we've developed in earlier lectures. And so he says, look, we look at what has happened to science and mathematics for thousands of years and science for hundreds of years, and particularly the combination of the two in the quantifiable and math-supported physical sciences. And we say, you know, here are the paradigms of truth, and ethical claims never look as obvious as the claims we find in mathematics and in quantifiable sciences. So it seems as if truth and objectivity, which we find in math and science, isn't possible in ethics. And he says, but that would be a mistake. You know, and I'll add something I maybe didn't bring back out excuse me, in my last lecture, and that is that, you know, if you go back even to a work like the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, I think Aristotle very explicitly in the Nicomachean Ethics, or the Nicomachean Ethics, however you want to say that, says this is a book on ethics. You know, I think it was the first ever full-length treatment of nothing but ethics. But as a sort of a preface to that work, he says, you know, this is not a work of geometry. This is not a work in mathematics. And so we should not expect, it would be foolish of us to expect the answers that we generate in a field like ethics to look like the answers we generate in mathematics. And I think in some ways he's speaking to this point we're addressing right here. We would be fools to expect the kind of certainty that we think we generate in mathematics and quantifiable sciences in fields like ethics, and specifically I would say in philosophical fields in general. That it's just, you know, it's just sort of apples and oranges there. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we collapse away from this idea of objective truth all the way down into relativism. I think that that would be a mistake. Another reason why we tend to do that and collapse out of absolutism and all the way down into relativism is that we often look at the most difficult and currently unresolved issues within you know, morals and ethics, and we point to these toughest issues and say, see, that's evidence that you can't have objectivity, that all you could ever have was cultural bias or individual level, you know, subjective interpretation and opinion. You know, Rachel says, look, that's, you know, we don't do that in science and we shouldn't do that in philosophy. I think that that's fair, but it may be not quite as convincing, you know, so maybe I would like to say, you know, return to the reductio about moral progress that I offered before. If you think it was moral progress that the United States, you know, moved past state-sanctioned racism to be dealing now with, you know, still systematic, but at least still on the surface of it, illegal expressions of racism. If you think it was progress that we moved beyond state-sanctioned versions of sexism in order to deal in the 20th and 21st century with just sort of the unconscious biases that we still maintain, if you think that was moral progress, then in some sense, you can't just point to the toughest issues and say that no objectivity is possible in morality. And then lastly, Rachel's argues that we often confuse the admitted challenge of persuading sometimes sort of stuck in their ways, stubborn individuals of the fact that we have a point. We confuse the difficulty of persuading them of something with having a point at all. And so I tried to make the case that we can show ourselves to develop more or less reasonable positions for kind of obvious claims like racism is morally wrong, even though there will be some people, right, who are going to be so sort of psychologically and emotionally entrenched in some identity that's tied to certain beliefs in the moment that they're going to, you know, they won't be able to open their ears to that. But we shouldn't necessarily confuse our inability to persuade some people with you know, some implication that we're unable to generate any kind of objectivity or reasonableness with regard to moral claims. And all of this boils down to kind of a false dichotomy, and that is that either moral claims are going to be true in much the same way that mathematical and scientific claims seem to be true, or it's all merely going to be relative. James Rachel's claimed in his writings that that moral judgments are truths of reason. I'm not a fan of that language. However, I think charitably I see where he's going with that. And it's this middle ground that I've been talking about between absolutism and relativism. This is where philosophy lives, right? Like this is what Socrates died for. Is there wisdom about questions with regard to life for which we don't have mathematical and scientific answers? You know, if in some sense your answer to that is, you know, there must be, then we need to try to inhabit the middle ground between absolutism and relativism. If we feel as if the answer to that question is no, then we collapse all the way to relativism. And I see this, and I've argued that in some sense this seems to be a kind of a giving up on morality as any kind of valuable pursuit or any kind of form of discourse that is valuable for us to practice in society. And I just don't see that as a viable option. And so this completes my review of my lecture on ethical relativism.